Okay, so we are in my mess of a front yard because we're going to do a little bit of home automation. Or rather, me and my husband have done some home automation, and I'm going to tell you a little bit about it. I have this kind of long running problem, pretty much as long as I've lived in this house, which has been years, where every summer start messing with some gardening and have to do irrigation because we have a really dry summer until it gets wet, which it has now. But even once it gets wet, it's usually not enough to keep the plants watered, and it feels a little bit silly to be using, a lot of city water for irrigation when we're getting a lot of water falling. It's just not enough getting to the garden, right? Well, I've got a lot of roof surface area, so we collect it into a tank, into a rain barrel. It's funny, the rain barrel actually came with a house. When we bought this house, there was a rain barrel sitting in the yard, and there were no gutters. So the only water it collected was just what fell right on top of the tank, which is, I assume the previous owner just, meant to put on gutters and never did. Well, we had gutters put on, so now there's actually water that goes into it. Here's the problem. We get these storms that can fill the tank completely in one storm. I don't have a very big one. I'll show it to you in a minute. I'm not sure what the capacity is, but it's not huge. But a storm will fill the tank. It's enough water to water the garden probably for a couple days, something like that. And then it's empty. And now we have to use, city water to water the garden. During the monsoon season, this cycle can repeat a lot. Often, there might be storms often enough that we don't have to use any city water. We're basically just time delaying the rain and taking advantage of the larger collection surface area of the roof. But sometimes the storms are too far apart and the tank runs empty. So I've always kind of been trying to figure out this method of irrigating the garden efficiently. I'm sorry if I need to get rid of those sheets of plastic. The wind does that. We'll just let it fall. So a couple years ago, I started really trying to come up with a solution to this. I built this whole thing with solenoid valves and a PLC that controlled it. It was a lot of fun, and then I learned a lot about PLCs, but the plumbing was horrible. I just made a lot of mistakes I would not make now. And since then, I've kind of had other attempts. And I think the thing that's happening, which is probably an insight into how to do these kinds of projects, is that every time I build something and then find out how poorly it actually works, my next attempt becomes simpler and stupider. So we're a couple of iterations through this process, and we're probably now almost as simple and stupid as it can get. I can think of some ways. Maybe simple is not the way to put it. Lazy is probably the way to put it. I'm doing things right now in software that I could easily do with relays. Actually, I wouldn't even need a relay with wiring, but it's just less labor to set it up in software. So I don't know that this is going to work great, but I'm going to tell you what I'm doing right now, and then I'm going to tell you kind of what my initial results are with it. I just finished up kind of rigging this up today, as we're really into the wet season, and so I could really avoid using much city water at all if this all works out. So how does it all start? Well, I have been using these Orbit Beehive valves for a while. If these break, I might replace them with a different product that is actually Zigbee. But these are, they're Bluetooth, but they communicate with a Wi-Fi gateway over the Bluetooth. They're perfectly reliable. The batteries last a long time and they're easy to replace. My only complaint about these is that they're totally dependent on a cloud service, and the cloud service is kind of slow. So when I manually open or close one of these valves, it takes 15 to 45 seconds for it to actually happen. I have a feeling that might have to do with power saving. These might sleep for a minute at a time or something. It's just a little bit annoying, and that's kind of why I want to go to a Zigbee product instead. But I don't know. This isn't like a review, but Orbit Beehive, you can buy it at Lowe's. They're not that expensive. And they seem to work just fine, both with their app, which is poorly designed but functional, or with HomeAssistant. Hopefully that airplane isn't too loud. They're taking off this way. So this is kind of where the city water comes from, is this this beehive valve. I'll just point out too, I don't have a backflow preventer here, which I probably should, but there's actually other, you'll see that, other backflow preventers other places. I do have a water hammer arrestor because I've got old plumbing in this house, and I don't know, solenoid valves always make me nervous. So I think that's worth the small investment in buying one of those and putting it on. Okay, and now here is the tank. This is from our local operation, but I don't actually know, I'm not sure how many gallons this is. I know I figured it out at one point. I just like measured it because I'm thinking about expanding the capacity, maybe by adding a second one of these, but you know, it's just a rain barrel. It's nothing too complicated. The gutters drop into it. It's got a screen filter, which does a little bit. I probably got to re-up it on mosquito dunks because the mosquitoes are horrible here these days. But at the output, now I have had this running in the past over the winter, so that's why this is all like crudely insulation taped, and there's actually there's like a heat trace in here as well. And that seems to have worked too. I've not had any freezing problems despite it going well below freezing. But the point is, we have the outlet of the tank that goes into that's a basket filter, which I should probably clean. Obviously having it covered in the insulation tape makes that a pain. And then the outflow from the tank goes into this valve box, which I put here just as some further help with avoiding freezing. This thing is actually, it's hard to open without tools, so I think I'm just gonna pick the whole thing up to show you that underneath there is a Harbor Freight Drummond pump. This is specifically their irrigation pump, which I am using because I need the pressure. This is feeding a low volume irrigation system, so it doesn't need to be a lot of pressure necessarily. It gets regulated to 25 PSI, but I do need 25 PSI, which is more than one of these centrifugal pumps will produce. Well, you know, that's actually also a centrifugal pump. It was seized today. So my husband took it apart and then basically put it back together, and now it works again. But I think I might have gotten some grit in it because the motor seems perfectly free running. It must have been the actual like impeller that was stuck. I think it got some gravel in it because we've got these like crusher fines. I do not like them, but every time you're like handling a hose, they get in there, and I bet the pump might have eaten some of the gravel, and that might have gotten it jammed. That's just my guess right now. So from the pump, the outflow, oh, and you probably saw there's the heating element. It's not hooked up right now because it's summer and it's not going anywhere close to below freezing, but during winter that kind of helps keep that from freezing over. So the line out of the pump goes to this backflow preventer. This is a vacuum breaker type. This solo cup, a very sun-faded solo cup, is just so that when the pump shuts off, a bunch of water sprays out of this when it lets the pressure go on the line. This is just so that more of that water goes down instead of getting all over everywhere on these shelves. But this backflow preventer, it's really just here, and then this whole loop of hose that goes up and over. And I got to get like a cover on this so it doesn't kink so much at the top there, because that's going to really affect the volume of water that gets through. That's a to-do. But this whole loop in the backflow preventer is here so that the contents of the tank will not just freely drain into the garden even when the pump isn't running, because it's not a positive displacement pump, so water will flow right through it. But this way, with this line up, right, what the vacuum breaker really does is when there isn't pressure on its inlet side anymore, it opens to the atmosphere, and that lets air come in, which drains down towards the pump and allows this loop over to drain. Now this is full of air, and there isn't the siphon effect anymore that will pull water into the garden. So I've got one hose that comes from the pump. I've got one hose. This comes from the beehive valve. And this I just rigged up with mostly stuff from the hardware store today. I'm not great with PVC, so it looks bad, but the thing I like about PVC is it's very forgiving. I kind of make a mess of it, and then it still seems to work pretty good. So what we have here is a check valve on each of these inputs. There's two of them, one on each input, and they are check valves, not vacuum breakers. That's sort of an important detail. There's actually a spring-loaded one-way valve in here. That's so that when the beehive valve opens, it will not backfeed water through the pump the other way into the tank. I think a lot of that water in practice would leak out of the vacuum breaker, but I don't know. I haven't actually totally tested what would happen, but I don't want to like risk it. So this basically makes sure that water only goes one direction. Similarly, it prevents the pump back feeding into the city water, which would be an even worse scenario. I think that's less likely to happen because there's the solenoid valve and stuff. There's multiple things to prevent that. Anyway, so this just combines the two with a T, and then the output goes to the low volume irrigation system in the garden bed, which is looking pretty nice right now. So that is the whole concept, right? Let's talk about how it's controlled a little bit, because control is one of the tricky problems. What I'm about to show you here, it's probably not a good idea. I think I'm gonna change it back, but I'll tell you how it's not a good idea. So this is a Zigbee power strip, and what I like about this is that each of these outlets is individually controlled over Zigbee. Maybe I'll give you a link to this too. Once again, not a review, but I've had this for, I don't know, like a couple months. I haven't had any problems with it. The instructions sucked. It took a minute to figure out how to pair it. It's sold for use with the, is it Aqara? The really popular system in China. And that stuff almost always works fine with HomeAssistant, but the instructions only tell you how to pair it with the app it's made for. And then I had to experiment with how many times to push the button or whatever to get it into pairing mode. Common irritation when you're buying cheap Zigbee stuff. So I got this because I have different lights that run off these cords, and this way I can kind of have one device that switches everything. But I'm also using this to control the pump. This is the thing I think is not a good idea. The spec sheet for this says that it's good for 15 amps. I don't know how far I trust that. The pump doesn't, I think it only draws like 4 amps when it's running, but the inrush on it can be quite a lot because it's got a big old motor. So I might switch it back onto one of these Zooz heavy-duty Z-Wave switches. Those are also rated to 15 amps, but I just trust them more, right? They're more expensive. But this turns the pump on and off. I'm also taking the USB power off of it here, and we'll take a look at that. I like this these waterproof plastic boxes, by the way. I'm using a lot of these now. They're convenient. You'll see another one right here. So here's where this USB power is going. In this, I just scared the shit out of myself. Here's the thing. It's 7 o'clock, which is when the irrigation is scheduled to run, and there's water in the tank. So this is working exactly as expected. The pump just came on, and sure enough, garden becoming full of water. This riser is not tall enough to get over these anymore, so that's a little, I might switch this to drip line anyway. I have the drip line ready to go. When we're trying to start seeds, I like to use the overspray stuff so that everything gets more evenly wet as far as the topsoil, but we're kind of at the point where we don't need that anymore. Okay, so what was I saying before it worked correctly and in the process briefly terrified me? Inside of this little box, that's gonna run for 20-25 minutes, which is good to know, because when the pump turns off, water's gonna come out of that vacuum breaker and get all over me. This is a Zooz Multi-Relay. I don't remember the model number on that. It might be ZEN74. The USB is just purely the power supply it uses, but this is a Z-Wave device, and it has 2 relays. I hope the pump, I bet I'm going to edit this and find out this is like unusable. Maybe the pump is way too loud. I might re-record the narration. But the point is, this has 2 relays and it has 2 switch inputs. I am purely using it right now for one of the switch inputs. That makes it a little overpriced for what I'm using it for, but it's got screw terminals. It's just a lot more convenient than what I have often done, which is taking a window sensor and desoldering the reed switch. Plus, I got it on sale for really cheap. I have like several of those and I use them all the time. So that's purely just a digital input via Z-Wave to HomeAssistant, and via this cable, which is hooked up to it, goes to a float switch, just a simple tip-tilt float switch, which is suspended in the tank, probably around here. So when the water gets down to that level, it falls, because it's floating on the water, it swings down, and once it's pointing down, a little ball rolls over and opens the circuit to that, which then sends a Z-Wave message, and that's how HomeAssistant knows whether or not there's enough water in the tank to run the pump. I have a kind of ugly script written up in HomeAssistant, and that kink actually isn't too bad. The pump makes enough pressure to kind of even it out, but still I should get something on that to make it, because it'll get worse over time. So I have kind of a weird HomeAssistant script written that basically the whole time the irrigation is running, checks that switch, and if that ever, switches to the other value, that there's no longer water in the tank, it shuts off the pump and it turns on the city water valve instead. So that's what I'm doing. So far it seems to be working, but I have not tested it for very long. What are the problems that I foresee? Number one, as I said, running this pump off of that power strip, probably not a great idea just because I don't trust the current rating on that power strip too far. It might be interesting to open that up and find out what the actual relays in it are and just how well it's made in general. Problem number 2, I don't think that this method of having HomeAssistant pull that Zooz Multi-Relay, and I say pull, it's not actually pulling it, it sends an event. I just have a script that's checking for whether or not, the value in HomeAssistant has changed. I don't think that's super reliable. It is some protection against the pump running dry. It's not great protection against the pump running dry. And if I had invested more money in that pump, I'd probably want something better. That float switch is actually rated for 15 amps. So I could run the power supply to the pump through the float switch, which would much better ensure that the pump does not run when the tank is dry. The reason I didn't do that is mostly just out of laziness, and I'd have to think out something a little bit more complex to have HomeAssistant know the state of the tank, because I want HomeAssistant to know that just for reporting. Okay, so I got the computer. I should just never be without it, where I was just working on some stuff related to my Ko-Fi that everyone should use to start giving me money straight away. A little plug there. There's a $5 tier. I'm sending out a little bit of bonus content. I'm still learning how to do that. It's not great. Much like this YouTube video, it's currently a little low effort and lazy, but I'm going to get better at it with time. Anyway, I just wanted to show you. This is what I've got in HomeAssistant. This is maybe I should use a screen recording, but of course I'm not. What you can see here is soil moisture data from the garden. There's 2 different sensors. They're just in different places and they tend to read differently. This shows me how much rainfall there's been. This is just kind of a way I can keep a quick glance on how irrigation in the garden is going. And here I have controls for irrigation. You can see it says the tank is wet. I know that's funny wording. That's just because of the type of entity it is in HomeAssistant. It's like a flood sensor entity. That's how I set it up. You can see the utility water valve is off, the pump is on. Let me show you what happens when I close the pump. That'll make the, or turn off the pump. That'll make the vacuum breaker thing make more sense. Okay, so you can see that vacuum breaker basically just kind of dumps the water pressure that was in that line, and that means it's not full of water on that loop up, which breaks the siphon that might keep draining water to to the pump. Similarly, I can open the utility water valve. Here's where you're going to get that point about how the beehive valves are kind of slow. I'm just waiting. Oh, there it went. That was actually faster than usual. So we can run it off of city water. And now we gotta wait for it to turn off again. There we go. I just heard that solenoid valve click over. Or we can use the pump. Same difference. I kind of want to try to get the PLC version working again, because it was probably a lot safer and more reliable than this. It also actually had flow monitoring on the water output to detect if like one of the lines comes loose or something and it just starts spewing water into the air. I would like to add that again. So there's lots of room for improvement here, but I think there's some value in, given how many problems the PLC solution that I built ended up having, like the fact that it leaked like a sieve. Probably not a bad idea to just sort of start with the basics right now and then add some complexity over time.